So continuing my series going over all of the major systems or upgrades going into Borderlands 4, we have the thing that I am most excited for, and that's the massive upgrades we're getting to skill trees. Now, Borderlands as a franchise being heavily inspired by ARPGs has always included skill trees, even though back in Borderlands 1, these skill trees were very small, but they have continued to get bigger and get more complex as we've gone through every new entry into the franchise. But going into Borderlands 4, the complexity and size of these skill trees have gotten absolutely massive compared to anything that's come previously. So if there was one system that I would say is going to have the biggest impact on your gameplay and experience going into Borderlands 4, it would have to be your skill trees. And these things are just incredibly exciting. So for every Vault Hunter in Borderlands 4, they're all going to have 3 different skill trees being either blue, red, or green. And each one of these skill trees are going to have their own action skill. So every Vault Hunter is going to have 3 different action skills to choose between. And choosing, say, an action skill of one skill tree or putting points into one of these skill trees doesn't mean you're locked out of the other skill trees when it specifically comes to passive nodes. But let's say you went into the red skill tree and you are using that action skill, you really can't go and use the action skill of other skill trees because of some of the other upgrades you'll be getting through the skill trees, specifically augments and capstones. You'll be unlocking pretty much only buff the action skill of that specific skill tree. Now, an example of one of these action skills is in the red tree for Vex, and this is Phase Familiar, which Vex is joined by her minion Trouble. When killed, Trouble will respawn after a cooldown. This is the kind of big elemental cat she gets, and you press your action skill ability to teleport Trouble, dealing damage in an area. Trouble then transforms into a badass, fully restoring health and gaining increased damage for a duration. Activating Phase Familiar will respawn Trouble if currently dead. So this is an action skill that gives you this permanent companion of Trouble. When they die, you can revive them. Then you have the active ability, which you teleport Trouble to an area, dealing damage and buffing them up pretty heavily. Every action skill is going to be something completely different. They're going to have their own damage values, their own cooldowns, and their own unique effects. As you would expect going from something like Borderlands 3, you have different action skills to choose between that all had their own unique effects. Now that's just the base version of the action skill, and that will bring you into the skill tree itself. Now the most basic version of nodes within these skill trees are the basic passive nodes, and these can be any number of things throughout all of these different skill trees, but these won't be like new active effects or anything like that. These will all be just like passive stat increases or new passive effects. So for instance, in this same Vex tree, you could get Hasty Fiends, which Vex and minions gain increased movement speed and damage reduction, and all of these different nodes will have different amount of points you can allocate to them. So that node we just went over, you could put 3 points into it. So with every new point, you'll get more movement speed, more damage reduction. A lot of the nodes end up being 5 points. Then in some of the trees, once you get to the very bottom, you can even get some more capstone style nodes that'll be 1 point, but will give you a much more substantial effect. And these passive nodes that can have varying amount of points you can allocate to them are the main place you're putting all of your skill points. And at the launch of Borderlands 4, once we get to max level, which is level 50, you'll have 49 points to allocate into these different skill trees. Now, after you've put 5 points into one of these passive nodes in your skill tree, you will unlock the next row. And unless some of these specific nodes have an arrow pointing to another node below it, you don't actually have to do any connecting of the nodes. So I could go put 5 points into the middle node of a tree and it'll unlock the entirety of the next row. And I can just put my points anywhere I want in that next row or the top row. So if I say put 15 points into the top row, it would still unlock those next handful of rows. You don't have to say put 5 points into the top row and then 5 points into the next row. You can just put them pretty much wherever you want and it'll keep unlocking those rows. Now this does change after you get to the 3 bottom boxes. So as you may have noticed with these skill trees, there's a much larger big box at the top that has 3 different rows. Then there are these 3 separate boxes at the bottom that are a little bit more specialized. So once you unlock all of the rows in the top box and you put enough points into to unlock the bottom boxes, you will then have to start specializing into whichever of these 3 bottom boxes you want, because you start to progress these 3 bottom boxes separately. So if I put 5 points into the leftmost bottom box, that will unlock the second row of that box only. You won't unlock the second row of the middle box or the right box. And this is pretty important because once you get to the very end of one of these bottom boxes, you then can get a capstone, which is one of the ways in which you change up or buff up your action skill. And that nicely brings us into the different augments and capstones you can have for your action skill. So at a baseline, you'll be able to add in 1 augment and 1 capstone that changes up your action skill. Now, what's really interesting with augments or capstones is that once you unlock a row that has either an augment or a capstone, you can freely switch between the augments or capstones anytime you want, and they don't cost any points to put into them. So with every tree, once you unlock the second row of the top box, you will unlock 2 different augments you can choose between. So for instance, in this same red tree of X, we could get Blind Strike as an augment for our action skill, which is Trouble. And this one specifically is actually adding another button you can use. So it's a command skill. You press and hold your action skill button to command Trouble to Blink Strike to a target, dealing damage. This Blink Strike will always crit any enemies below 50% life. So this is essentially adding a secondary activated ability to your Trouble action skill. And at a baseline, you can have 1 augment at a time. And the next set of augments you can unlock is the first row of the bottom 3 boxes. So you'll have a total of 5 different augments to choose between in each one of the skill trees for each Vault Hunter. So you have a bunch of different variations of augments to add in to change up or buff up your action skill. And then that brings us to capstones, which are only found at the very bottom of the 3 bottom boxes, are usually stronger and more specified effects for your action skill. They're usually passive effects that change up how that action skill works in some way. And it isn't necessarily even changing up that action skill specifically, but it is buffing some effect within your action skill. So for instance, in that same Vex tree, we have Trouble Bubble, which Trouble now gains Overshield whenever he deals damage, and while Phase Familiar is active, which is the active effect of Trouble, Trouble gains an Elemental Aura, dealing ordnance damage over time to nearby enemies. So with this specific capstone, it massively buffs up the damage and survivability of Trouble, so just buffing up your action skill and adds new effects to them. And this is generally what every capstone is going to be doing. It's just going to be a really big buff to the action skill, usually adding in new effects or changing up the elemental damage, and I would say on average are just much stronger versions of augments. And with how many skill points we can earn at the launch of Borderlands 4, you're really only going to be unlocking 1 capstone at a time. You can go get another capstone, but you can't go get like a capstone in 2 separate trees, and capstones are generally only buffing up the effect of the action skill within that tree, so it really wouldn't even make sense to go get capstones of another tree. And a majority of the time, these capstones are so different in what you would want to be building and using them for that it really doesn't even make sense to unlock multiple capstones, because also these bottom boxes are usually focused on something that the capstone also buffs. So maybe in one of the skill trees, the leftmost box would be focused on buffing up like radiation damage and giving new radiation damage effects. Usually that capstone would also buff up radiation damage or add radiation damage or something to that effect to the action skill itself. So one of the main ways people are going to be building their skill trees is you're going to progress throughout the top tree, you're going to progress throughout one of the boxes to get the capstone you want, and then you're either going to look for more passives in that main skill tree, or you're going to go to one of the other colored skill trees and put points into some of the passive nodes in those as well. And that's primarily how you're going to be building all of the different builds for all the different Vault Hunters. And one of the main goals for how they created the skill trees in Borderlands 4 is to allow one action skill to be played in a bunch of different ways. So let's say you go into the Trouble Tree of X, there should be a bunch of different play styles that you can build into just in this one skill tree. And the different mixes of augments and capstones is a really big part of that, because there are some pretty crazy possible combinations you can get with the different augments and capstones you can find in these different skill trees. And a final aspect of these skill trees that are more specifically tied to that Vault Hunter itself is the Vault Hunter traits. So every Vault Hunter is going to have one trait that buffs up or augments different aspects of their build, and it's going to be completely different for every Vault Hunter. So for Vex, she has Phase Covenant. Vex is attuned to the elemental type of her current gun, converting all action skill and melee damage into that type. So they show that you could have your Trouble cat sitting in front of you, and she will normally be purple, which isn't an element. But if you say switch to a poison damage, Trouble will then switch to a green cat that does poison damage. Or if you switch to a cryo weapon, she would switch to a cryo cat. And that is only Vex's trait. But if you say go to Rafa, he has an overdrive skill that when you're in an action skill or for 10 seconds after it ends, he gains movement speed and a damage buff. And then there are a bunch of different skills throughout a skill tree that buff up that overdrive trait. For Harlow, anybody you hit with action skills links them all together and makes them take sheer damage. And for Eamon, any action skill he chooses, you get a secondary action skill based upon that action skill. So one of his action skills is this thing that buffs you up, increases your incendiary damage, but his secondary action skill to that is a big molten hammer you slam on the ground. So these traits are going to be pretty big parts of these Vault Hunters that can play into all of their different skill trees. And when thinking about all of these different skill trees and all of these different possibilities with the action skills, with the augments, with the capstones, and with all the passive nodes, that a lot of these passive nodes and effects will play into pretty much every other aspect of the game. Like for instance, Rafa has a lot of different effects in their skill trees that plays back into ordnance damage, or more specifically grenades, spawning free grenades, buffing up ordnance damage reducing your cooldown or giving you other buffs, and you'll have those different type of effects scattered throughout all of the skill trees of all of the Vault Hunters that play into pretty much any other effect you can find in the game. Every elemental damage, melee damage, gun damage, shielding, health, everything you could possibly imagine that can exist in the game in combat will be found in at least one of the skill trees from one of the Vault Hunters. But that's pretty much everything you need to know about skill trees going into Borderlands 4. If there was one thing that I am most excited about in Borderlands 4, it's builds in general. But if I had to dilute that down to one thing specifically, it would be these skill trees and how a bunch of different things tie into these skill trees, how you can change your different action skills with your augments and capstones, and just the amount of variation we're going to get in build crafting because these skill trees are so much bigger and so much more intricate. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.